Shabbat Shalom, everybody. This morning in my news feed, I read an article about how Israelis are coping with some of the most challenging moments of these last few months with humor. And if you've spent time in Israel, you know that there's a certain brand of dark comedy that Israelis are attracted to. Some of it doesn't translate very well, but you can find a lot of really funny pieces online in your social media feed. If you go to Eretz Nehederet, there are all sorts of different examples of this. And so I was thinking about the way humor can help us cope with some of the more challenging aspects of our lives. And then I was thinking about this week's Torah portion, which includes some dark moments. We start to hear about the 10 plagues. And in honor of one of my comedy heroes, I was thinking about 10 plagues, and so I was thinking about David Letterman, and I know for some of the young people in the room, you don't know who David Letterman is, but Brian could tell you afterwards, and he could give a master class in what an exceptional comedian he was. But back in the day, you'll remember, those of you old enough, David Letterman every night started his monologue with his top 10 list. And according to Wikipedia, the first time he brought the top 10 list into our television sets was in September of 1985. And arguably one of the very first top 10 lists, or lists of 10, period, in recorded history appears in our Bible, in the book of Exodus, where we are right now, the 10 plagues. So here goes. I'm going to give you tonight's list. And I just want you to imagine for a moment, and remember what I said about the dark comedy part, imagine for a moment an Egyptian stand-up comic getting up about 3,500 years ago, and he's opening up his act, and he says, these are the top 10 signs that the God of the Israelites wants you to let his people go. And you're going to be Paul Schaefer. Okay, there you go. Okay. Top 10 signs that the God of the Israelites wants you to let his people go. Number 10, your cruise down the Nile ends with you bailing blood. Thank you. We need a laugh track and an applause sign. Thank you. Number 9, tonight's forecast, frogs. Thank you. Number 8, did I mention the lice, ladies and gentlemen? Number 7, last night, the Pharaoh shot a wild beast in his pajamas. How he got in his pajamas, I don't know. Number 6, what's the deal with cattle disease? Thank you. And number 5, hey, Pharaoh, is that a boil on your neck, or are you happy to see me? Number 4, it's hailing fire. We're almost there. Number 3, hey, I like chocolate-covered grasshoppers as much as Ramses, but seriously, guys. Number 2, hello, who turned out the lights? And the number 1 sign that the God of the Israelites wants you to let his people go, and at this point, the Egyptian pundits crowd has turned on him. You didn't do that to me, thank you. You could have, but you chose not to as an act of kindness. But in this imaginary stand-up act, it's not funny at all anymore, because what started off as a joke has gotten very uncomfortable. We've made it to the 10th plague, and it's the worst of them all. It's awful, it's unjust, it's wrong. What kind of God would make children suffer because of their parents' sins? It doesn't make sense, and yet it's right there in our Torah. We have to try to grapple with it. We have to try to make sense of it. But when you pause and reflect for a moment, you must admit that this happens actually all the time. It's not just some fanciful scenario that we find in our Bible, but we actually see it in the world all the time. Children end up suffering because of the sins of their parents. Think about what we're witnessing today in Gaza. Children are suffering because of the terrible actions and choices made by the Hamas leadership. And there are many tens of thousands of willing collaborators. But tonight, because of the Jewish month that we find ourselves in, I want to talk about a different way in which children suffer because of the decisions made by their parents. Yesterday, if you're following the lunar calendar, you might have noticed we got the new moon. The moon sort of disappears and then it comes back. Now, I'm not an expert in these things, but I know that the moon doesn't actually disappear. It's just kind of the way it looks from our perspective. But the new month in the Jewish calendar always comes when you see the moon return, that little sliver. And that was just yesterday. And it's the month of Shvat. And in this month, we celebrate the holiday of Tu B'Shvat. On the 15th day of the month of Shvat, we have Jewish Arbor Day. It's our new year for the trees. And actually, right here on our campus, there's a beautiful tree in the circle that blossoms every year in late January. And so we're just about to see it. And it's the same in Israel. The first tree to blossom usually is the almond tree. And we see that January, February. So it's the beginning of spring. So Shvat is this beautiful month where we celebrate nature. And I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about this silly top 10 list, and you'll see how they come together in a moment, when I read this week that 2023, the year that just passed, was the hottest year in recorded history, going back to 1850, when scientists started tracking global temperatures. And in fact, the 10 hottest years since 1850, you guessed it, number 10, are the last 10 years. The last 10 years are the 10 hottest years in recorded history. And everything we're reading suggests that the window of time available for us to do anything to try to affect what's happening in terms of climate change is closing. And there's a lesson at the end of this week's Torah portion about how we should think about our relationship to our planet that I think can be helpful to us. And God forbid we would give up and say, there's nothing we can do, it's too late, just, let's burn some more coal. I don't want us to go there. I want us not to give up hope that we might be able to make a difference. But I want to share this verse from this week's Torah portion that I think teaches us something profound about our relationship to the planet. Almost at the end of this parashah, Parashat Va'era, it seems like Pharaoh is finally going to relent and finally let the Jewish people go. And if you know the story, which most of you do because we repeat it every Passover, it looks several times in the story that Pharaoh's going to relent and let the Israelites go, and then Pharaoh changes his mind. And in fact, the Torah even tells us that God helps Pharaoh to change his mind by hardening Pharaoh's heart. But at the end of this week's Torah portion, it really looks like Pharaoh's going to let the Israelites go. And he says to Moses, this is after the plague of the hail, Pharaoh says to Moses, ask God to stop the thunder and the hail, and if you do that, I'll let your people go. And then Moses replies to Pharaoh, and it's so interesting that we read this verse every year right around this time, around this month of Shvat, when we celebrate the new year of the trees. Moses replies to Pharaoh and says, as soon as I leave your presence, I will spread out my hands to God, and the thunder shall cease, and the hail shall stop. And then Moses says, so that you may know that the earth belongs to God. So that you may know that the earth belongs to God. And in its original context, what's Pharaoh saying? What is Moses saying? Moses is saying to Pharaoh, look, whether it hails or snows, thunder and lightning, it's all part of God's universe, and God controls it all. And you need to know that, Pharaoh. And of course, what is the logical implication of that? If God controls all these things, then if God tells you to let the Israelites go, you should let the Israelites go. And the Hebrew at the end is very beautiful. It says, Lama'an teda ki la'adonai ha'aretz, so that you should know, Pharaoh, that the earth belongs to God. But the medieval commentators, writing about 1,200 years ago, noticed something sort of strange about that verse, the one that says the earth belongs to God. Because elsewhere in the Bible, and kids especially, this is a very helpful Jewish reading technique. You notice one verse that says X and another verse that says Y, and it seems to be slightly at odds with X. That's an opportunity to try to interpret and make meaning. And we can use that same skill in any book that we read. So elsewhere in the Bible, in the Psalms, Psalm 115, it's a slightly different formula. It says, Hashamayim shamayim ladonai, which means the heavens belong to God. And in the Psalm, it says, V'ha'aretz natan livnei adam. It says, but the earth has been given to humanity. And so you see why it seems to be at odds? Because in the verse in this week's Torah portion, it says that the earth belongs to God. But in the verse in the Psalms, that's a very well-known verse, it says, Haaretz natan livnei adam. So which is it? Is the earth ours to do whatever we want with it and to it? Or does the earth belong to God? And this is why I think it's so important in terms of how we think about the world. Is it ours to do with what we want? Or is it something that we are here to steward and to shepherd and to care for? So there's a dispute in Jewish tradition. Which one is it? Dr. David Goldblatt, who's an environmental scientist but also a scholar of Torah, he points out a midrash, which is a rabbinic interpretation that comes later, that pulls these two verses together. The one verse from this week's Torah portion that suggests that the earth belongs to God, and the verse in the Psalms that says that the earth belongs to humanity. And what he says is that human dominion over the earth is conditional on our following God's will. If we do as God has asked us to do throughout our daily lives, in our interactions with other people, and also in our interactions with the environment we find ourselves in, then the earth is ours. God will give it to us for our use and our enjoyment. But if not, the earth will revert to God. And I've been thinking a little bit about this as I read recently, people talk about we need to save the planet. And I read a piece that said, we don't need to save the planet. The planet's going to be here. We need to save ourselves. We will find a way to make the planet uninhabitable for us, but the planet will still be here. And the interesting thing I read is, one estimate is that within about 500 years of human beings being extincted or extincting ourselves, the earth actually will revert in terms of climate and environment back to how it once was. That's about how long it would take if we just got out of the way for everything to kind of normalize and go back to the way it's supposed to be. So that's the midrash. The earth has been given to us. It's our planet if we treat it properly, if we follow God's will. And if not, God will take it back and we won't be here anymore. The modern period, the last few hundred years, can really be characterized as the first time in human history in which we really did hold dominion over the earth. We've actually demonstrated that we have the ability to change the climate. But that period is over. We are clearly not in control of this earth anymore. And the truth is, if we have a little bit of humility, we'll recognize that we never were. So the debate in the Midrash about who owns the world, I'm just going to suggest it doesn't even matter. The world is our home, whomever is in control of it. And if we don't do something now, something real, something meaningful, we and our children and our children's children will continue to suffer. Over the winter break, my family and I traveled to Southeast Asia. It was an amazing trip, and we spent time in Vietnam and in Cambodia. And I'd been there once before, 12 years ago, and every one of our guides said the same thing. Every one of our guides mentioned how in their own lifetime in the last 2 decades, how they've seen the climate change in their own part of the world and how that has affected their lives materially. It was hot when we were there. This is the dry season, and it's supposed to be warm, but not as warm as it is right now. And I bet a lot of us in this room can tell our own stories about things that we've noticed, changes we've seen in our own lifetimes. So it's not just someday our children might suffer. We're seeing that happening right now. Perhaps we have the opportunity, perhaps, I'm not going to give up hope, that we can make some changes, we can make some decisions that are different than the ones we've made before, that might be able to prevent that final plague. But we need to rise up and embrace that responsibility. Whomever the earth belongs to, whether it's ours or it's God's, it's the only world we have. We should act before it's too late. Shabbat Shalom.